Hey, David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Corey. Glad to be here.
So, before we get started on your story, I noticed something really interesting on your website today that I really hadn't heard about before, and that's the Blue Mind movement
Mhm.
about how being near, in, or underwater is good for our mental health, anxiety, pretty much everything. And
That-
I got to say, like, wow, yes, that I mean, like, the ocean is my happy place.
Awesome. It makes total
So,
sense when you hear that, though, right? It's almost silly that we need science to tell us that, but there is a great deal of science behind that, and you're right. And that is my happy place as well. It's also where I've learned how to moderate myself, right, and to meditate and to get grounded, especially when things are a little chaotic. So, absolutely.
how'd you discover this movement?
I ran across a book some years ago. I think it was published 10 or so years ago by the name of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Wallace J. Nichols. Middle initial is J, and they called him J. Jay wrote a book called Blue Mind, and it was about the science of how water has all of these benefits. And he also had, obviously, a vested interest in preserving this rare commodity that we have in our world because it's so important to us. And that goes along with climate change and some other things. And Jay wrote this book not realizing how important it was, and it was translated last I heard into some 76 languages. And every year, Jay took the time to do a free book club on Facebook video going through the book with anyone who wanted to join him because he's still that passionate about sharing that science in a world that's increasingly stressful. Sadly, Jay passed away just this past June on Father's
Hmm.
Day in a horrible accident, but his work lives on and his momentum certainly lives on.
For sure. Yeah. No, I did not hear about his death. I did see that they are releasing a 10th anniversary edition in December, and I think that's going to be a Christmas gift to myself.
Wonderful.
It's just, but you're right. It's funny how we don't think about like how simplistic that is, how water is just so transformative for our minds.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
And it's one could even consider it almost an introduction to meditation. So, people who haven't been practicing meditation for a long time can be intimidated by it. They have this perception that this is supposed to quiet their mind and shut
yeah,
everything off. And in fact, what meditation does is it makes it more clear as to how the mind is working so that we can make conscious choices as to whether or not we believe what it's saying or not. Right. That's more about what meditation is. But the science behind Blue Mind is an opportunity to jump into that meditation realm. So imagine yourself looking at the ocean or a lake or a river, and the sun is shining off of it and it's reflecting off the waves. That is a just in and of itself meditative. It's kind of like staring at a campfire because the
right.
randomness of the flames and the randomness of the waves, it brings the energy down, right? In a good way, right? It's a calming energy. So it's a great entryway into meditation for a lot of people.
Definitely. Yeah. So, Kendall and I are kind of selfish in that we both have summer birthdays, and we like to celebrate our birthday month as opposed to the day.
Ah,
So,
good for you.
sort
Good
of
for you.
kicking off a long birthday weekend tomorrow. We're actually going to be spending time with Kendall's half sister, one of our found family, which is
Mhm,
one of the
mhm.
reasons why we moved to New England. And I got to spend a long weekend in New York City with Stephanie and three of her nurse friends, and we became instant, like, as soon as we saw each other, we were like best pals. And
Awesome.
so this is the first time I'll be getting to see BJ again, one of the nurses, and so very excited about that. We'll be in Boston tomorrow, so very near the water. Then on Saturday, we're going to Lake Winnipesaukee, and then going to enjoy the Doobie Brothers concert there. And then on Sunday, which is kind of sort of starting an annual tradition, we're going to be meeting up with Kendall's half brother and his family in Wells, Maine, and we're going to go to the beach. And I will definitely be doing some meditating. I love just sitting there with my toes in the water and the sand and just letting the tide roll up on it. And then when it gets a little bit warm, then I will go like, waist deep and just
Mhm.
stand there and stare at the horizon and just,
Beautiful.
yeah,
Beautiful.
and relax. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, happy birthday. You and I share summer birthdays. I have a birthday coming up in 5 days yet. I don't have the benefit of getting a whole week or a whole month for it. I get one day if I'm lucky, but I'll take it. I'll take it. And that's,
Explain.
as you can imagine, that's profound, right? For an adoptee or an NPE who was reluctant to even acknowledge their birthday because of all the heavy, powerful emotions that it brought. I'm glad
Yeah.
that I could take that day and reflect on things positive. Absolutely.
So what are you going to do for your birthday this year, David?
My kids live not too far away, down in Illinois. They're both my adult children. We're going to go down. My wife and I. We're going to go to one of our favorite outdoor restaurants. We're at Long Lake, Michigan, and we're going to watch the Air and Water Show for the afternoon and
Oh,
just spend time as a family. Yeah.
very cool. Very cool.
Looking
Well,
forward
I
to
don't know
it.
if you're aware, I'm a Midwestern boy. I'm from
I
St. Louis.
am.
And one of the best vacations I remember as a kid, we didn't have much money growing up, but we spent a week in the Wisconsin Dells, and that was
Oh,
just
right.
that still sticks out in mind. I was maybe 10 years old, and it
Okay.
was
Okay.
a really, really good time
Well,
with the
good for
family.
you. It's a great time, and you would, if you haven't been back, you'd probably be surprised by how much it's grown in the last 40 years. It's really a remarkable place.
I
Absolutely.
believe it. I believe
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
So, all right, let's get into your story. Kendall and
Sure.
I were talking about this over the phone this afternoon, and I don't think we've used the word or heard the word relinquished on the podcast yet. So,
Mhm.
what is your definition of relinquished?
Certainly. Well, my definition of relinquished is very simple and is very similar to the dictionary definition. It means that one is given up or abandoned, straightforwardly. The term was originally used by a therapist in England by the name of Paul Sunderland. Paul Sunderland has made a lasting contribution to our adoption community in that he did a lecture in 2011 and 2012 titled Adoption and Addiction Remembered Not Recalled, where he talks for about 53 minutes. And by the way, it's available free on YouTube. He talks about that relationship between addiction and adoption and all that means, but he uses the term relinquishment because he reasons, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to speak for him, he reasons that adoption does not fully describe the experience that adoptees have had. There was something that happened in their lives for them to have to deal with the adoption, and that was the relinquishment. And what we know about pre-verbal adversity and processing of life, being in the womb, all of those things come into play long before one is adopted. So one sometimes might have to deal with both of those things. For example, in my case, I was certainly relinquished by my birth mother. And I don't mean, when I say relinquished, I don't mean people did this willy-nilly, right? Oftentimes people were coerced. This was not necessarily a willing abandonment that was done in my case, but I was relinquished, and I was later adopted into a family who was wonderful and loving and gave me every opportunity to succeed, but I struggled nonetheless to attach with them. So identifying those as two separate problems allows me to develop a more comprehensive healing solution to that which ails me.
How soon did your adoptive family let you know that you were adopted?
Just like the story that I've heard from Kendall, I knew from as long as I can remember. I don't remember not knowing that I wasn't adopted. They said it proudly. They told everyone who came in contact with me, and it was never really an issue, at least internally. Now, looking back on that, I'm not sure I really know what that meant. I didn't separate the two. I couldn't verbalize what that meant. What does that mean before I was adopted into this family? Yet, as we all do, and the psychologist David Brodzinski says, everybody who is relinquished is searching, whether they're actually engaged in a formal search or not. They're thinking about it, and that was my thinking about it. Right? Where did I come from? Why did these people relinquish me? I just got tidbits of stories from my adoptive parents. They told me, your mother was a redheaded cheerleader from the University of Wisconsin, and your father was a player on the football team. And when they got pregnant with you, they didn't want to interrupt their college, so they gave you up for adoption. Of course, to someone who doesn't understand, that's my perception was, oh my gosh, that seems really selfish a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, these people did the deed, right? That they became in a family way. They were expecting to have a
Mhm.
baby, and then said, "Well, sorry, we're not willing to do that." Well, that's ultimately the way I envisioned that search process. So throughout the years, of course, I dreamed, I imagined, who were these people? Right? Oh, where did I come from? Where did they come from? I had this fantasy that literally Norma Jean Mortensen, Marilyn Monroe was my mother. Right? And,
Hmm.
and, and that was really early on. Of course, she died, I think, in 1962 or 63. So it's one of my first memories ever. But I preserved it over time because just her death didn't mean she wasn't my mother, right? But that was my belief. And probably a long-winded way to ask your question, but that's how I perceive all of that.
Interesting. Oh, good. Maryland. Yeah. So, a couple of topics that we've started to explore a little more in depth recently are that of birthday trauma and the primal wound. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about that and maybe how that affected your
Sure. Sure.
upbringing?
The primal wound, and some people call it a theory, but I've been investigating it so long and so involved in this community. I don't believe it's a theory. I think it plays out in real life for many of people, and I don't think it's a stretch to understand that when a child is, or any mammal for that matter, but a child is biologically removed from its mother of origin, its biological mother, that there are going to be interruptions in the developmental process, whatever those might be. There may be physical interruptions because you're not getting the nourishment or that you are from your very own birth mother. There may be psychological adjustments that have to be made in terms of safety. There may be emotional adjustments. You're not there. You're not smelling your mother. And the breast milk that you've become accustomed to or maybe never had. Right? And all of these things represent what is called a primal wound. I believe it's true. What does it really mean? Well, that's a really good question, right? I mean, back to Paul Sunderland. Paul Sunderland said that people who were adopted or relinquished, we should assume that they have a type of developmental trauma or a developmental PTSD. That's a really interesting discussion. I know a lot of people in our community talk about that, and I could talk about that at great length. But for now, let me say, the primal wound, I believe to be real. It's kind of like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as we know it today. Like 10 years ago, people had problems believing that trauma happening in one's youth could affect them for all of their lives. We understand how a soldier might go to Afghanistan and witness some horrific things, and then she comes home and might be affected very negatively for life, including depression, suicidality, all things. But we could never understand that something happening as an infant or being a child could maybe be directing one or informing judgments later on in life. And ultimately, that's what I believe happened. And I believe that's what the primal wound is. But just like PTSD, it doesn't happen for everyone, right? There's this belief in the adoptee community that you're either in the fog, that is, you don't understand the effects of the primal wound are having you as you're living your life today, or you're not understanding that the struggles you might have had attaching due to that primal wound, how they may be affecting today, or you understand that. There's nothing in the middle. There's no room for ambiguity. So there are actually people out there who understand that they've been relinquished. They know that they've been adopted, and they have somehow been able to process this and to, I guess, be at peace with it without having to further delve into issues of identity, looking for systems that may have failed, all the things that many of us go through and trying to form my own identities. There are people who actually do okay with it.
Yeah.
We tend to call them, or the world tends to call them naive, right? Oh no, they're in the fog. They just don't get it. No, maybe they just have a different ability for whatever reason. It doesn't make them better or worse. Maybe they just have this different ability to process all of this and to integrate all this information into their lives without getting tripped up by it. I'm not that person. It's taken me years to integrate all this stuff. I've been tripped up. There have been times in my life where I can identify directly when and how. So anyway, long answer, but that primal wound, I believe, is very prevalent, and not everyone is affected by it, just like not everyone who goes to war comes home and is affected, right? As we understand
Right.
the statistics, about 50% of those individuals who have traumatic events have PTSD. I don't know. We don't have statistics on how many people who are relinquished later have developmental difficulties, but I'm guessing the number is at least similar, if not higher. So that's what I would say about the primal wound. To answer your question about the birthday trauma, right? I mean, for years, people in my life wanted to celebrate my birthday, and I just didn't feel like it was something I could attach to or connect to. I didn't do anything to be born. I didn't do anything. Why are we celebrating something that was not an achievement? It just happened, and it actually happened at a time where I can't go back and find out any information about it. At the time, I could. Right? For much of my life, I had no information surrounding what led up to my conception, my birth, or shortly thereafter. So I resented birthdays. I didn't want to celebrate birthdays. I would acknowledge them for the sake of my wife and my children, but I didn't want to go there because to me, they were exhausting times. They meant I had to go deep and dark into those places and wonder about the things that I may never have answers to. And of course, being an adoptee or a relinquishee, sometimes we confabulate answers that are not great. We catastrophize, right? There must be something wrong with me. The evidence I have for that is that I was given up. Everyone in the world can see that there's something wrong with me. Why would I want to draw attention to myself on my birthday and let everybody know that something's wrong with me? I've since gotten to be in a much better place about that. I recognize my birthday for what it is, not just simply through acceptance, but because I have found out a lot of information and a lot of context surrounding how that worked and what led up to it. And I'm just in a much better place about that today.
Good. Well, happy birthday to my fellow Leo.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Always good to hang with a Leo.
Yes. Now, going back to the PTSD, yes, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I do think, though, that there might be something that's either buried or gets triggered later on down the line, because I don't think Kendall experienced that primal wound until we discovered his birth family and his birth mother's reluctance to have anything to do with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that just brought that trauma just all the way up to the top. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
I mean, he was fine with the fact that we might not ever find his birth family. Like, I think he just like, not that he gave up, but just like, hey, I've got your
Mhm.
family. I had a wonderful adoptive family. We've got our chosen family. But then once we made that discovery, I mean, that's continuing to be the primal wound is still very, very prevalent
Absolutely.
in
That,
him.
that
Yeah.
rejection plays over and over in our lives in many different ways, and that is a very significant one. Some people term it secondary rejection, being rejected or being relinquished at one time, now being rejected again later on. And
Right.
perhaps that may have happened in relationships throughout our life in many other different ways as well. But it's a pattern that until we consciously identify it and try to work through it, it's one that is really, as you suggested, primal. It is really raw and deep and painful. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So another topic we haven't deeply explored on this podcast, but a few weeks ago we did have guests on, Beth and Joey, adoptive mother and an adoptee, and Joey started to experience trauma, and the way he dealt with it was self-medication
Mhm.
through drugs.
Mhm.
And so I know this is something that you relate to. So talk a little bit about like what path you went down and how you got into that addiction, and then how you
Sure,
got off.
sure. And I have told this story for years, and it gets simpler over time because I don't want to confuse people with the nuance. So I'll say it in a very general way, and then if that's okay with you, we could talk about some of the
Yeah.
subsets of it. But ultimately, when I was a child, I struggled. I struggled to attach. I struggled to feel safe. I struggled in situations where they're human beings, not knowing what to do. And I assumed that everybody else knew exactly what to do. And I just wasn't given that set of tools, which was another reason that I had every bit of evidence that I was defective. Um, but I didn't have a language for it. I couldn't explain it at the time. Yet I assumed it was my fault. Right? I never thought, boy, maybe my parents aren't really good at connecting with me, or I never thought maybe the social workers gave them bad advice when they told my parents, treat that child as if your own and don't talk about anything else. Don't talk about the truth. Don't process this. Don't have family discussions, right? But you asked earlier, how long have I known I was adopted? Well, from the very beginning, but as we know, there's a huge difference between knowing was and is adopted and actually processing what that means to everybody involved and exposed to that adoption, particularly in a family environment where it happens after all of those years. So this is something that I certainly struggled with, and really spent a lot of time isolating and being fearful and pushing away from relationships as best I can for fear that I was going to be judged, or I was going to be looked at as defective, or that I was going to make a mistake in a relationship that was irreparable. So I was very cautious in growing up. And then something really magical happened quite by accident. And it happened early in my life. Doesn't always happen this early in other people's lives, but at age 13, I happened upon alcohol. I was hanging out with a group of individuals a little older than myself. We started drinking some beer. And although maybe in the first two or three sips, I didn't really realize the magic of it. But by the time I had two down, my first two beers, I knew this was something that was real. And I had that feeling, I have to say, Corey, that I felt connected in a way I'd never felt connected with human beings before. I
Yeah.
felt that we had found a solution to life, and we had found a camaraderie that nobody else had. And I pursued that. I pursued that for many, many years. What I realized looking back upon it is I found a connection to alcohol. What I did at that time, unknowingly, is instead of struggling through life and processing life and developing healthy coping mechanisms, maybe reaching out for others for help to do that, I found alcohol, and that substituted for every bit of distress I had going forward in life, or lots of distress. So my brain learned early on, it wired itself in a way to know that if you're stressed, that alcohol will settle you down, right? It'll stop that voice in your head that tells you you're so defective, right? If only temporarily, right? But that's what happened with me. And I used that, and I went to that go-to coping mechanism without really realizing that's what I was doing. Right? I thought I'm just having a good time. Right? I think of the movie Animal House, which is so unpolitically correct in this day and age, but there was a scene in it where Boone and Katie are outside after the rush party, and Katie asks Boone, she said, what are you going to do? Get drunk every weekend with a bunch of animals? She said, no, after I graduate, I'm going to get drunk every night. And to me, that was the unwritten signal of success. If I'm getting drunk every night, that means I've got more friends and more connection than anybody on the face of this earth. And guess what? We know that not to be true. And it was actually a very false connection, right? Because when the alcohol goes away, what's left? Did we ever have meaningful connections? Did we ever get to know one another truly. So, and I did that for a good 32 years before it almost literally killed me.